unleashing female power.
Being a disruptor.
I'm always constantly telling the truth.
I love
art. That's all her life.
She's alive and female.
Being a woman, what it meant.
Prove him wrong.
Girls run the world.
We're rocking the place.
Welcome to the Art Pod. I'm your host, Carolina, and I'll be your guide through this Pandora's box. Strap yourselves in for a journey through the art world where we bring you candid conversations, untold stories, uncover industry secrets, and celebrate the women who are shaping its future. Because in the Art Pod, the spotlight is always on the girls. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Art Pod. My guest today is Nazy Nazhand. Welcome.
Thank you.
So a little bit about Nazy. She is a New York-based art advisor, creative consultant, writer, and the founder of Nazhand Art and Culture, a pioneering advisory firm at the nexus of contemporary art and innovative partnerships. Known for discovering and supporting artists who examine the complex socio-political and technological developments of our time, Nazy transdisciplinary practice harnesses the confluence of visual arts with fashion, music, film design, and civic engagement to realize strategic opportunities in new markets and forge creative collaborations that challenge the status quo. Nazhand Art and Culture positions itself at the center of this disciplinary convergence, providing clients with a global perspective and forward-thinking initiatives to bring their vision to life, whether via consulting on important institutional exhibitions, fostering brand partnerships and artist collaborations, realizing feature films, or building valuable art collections. Drawing on 2 decades of experience in contemporary art and media establishments, the advisory's philosophy combines market expertise with a commitment to collaborative, genre-defying endeavors. Wow. So let's get into it. I really want to start the podcast with talking a little bit about your background because I find you to be so fascinating. So you were born in Tehran in the wake of the Iranian Revolution and the Iran-Iraq War. And then in 1985, you moved to Athens. And then in 1987, you immigrated to America. So can we talk a little bit about that? Because for a child, that's a lot to take in. So I kind of wanted to touch on that and then kind of understand your experience and, I'm sure, Athens and America were culture shocks for you in the beginning. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Hi. Thank you for having me. It was not a normal childhood. It was quite abnormal. It was dangerous. It was traumatic, but so was others. It wasn't, I wish I could say mine was unique, but we're talking millions who went through it. But yet I was quite young. We were just, my brother was a baby. I was, a few years older than him, but I don't remember the revolution, which is the thing that really traumatized my family and their generation. Mm-hmm. But the Iran-Iraq war, which happened shortly after, and it lasted for 9 years, was quite violent. And we left in the middle of the war, where many families left right at the revolution and kind of escaped early on. It took us a while to escape, if you will, because there is really no other word. You don't just, pack up and travel. You have to actually escape for your life. At least with our situation, it was a little bit more difficult than it could have been, actually. And I grew up in the middle of an actual war, and not new war of technology, but the old-fashioned kind with bombs, missiles, curfews, sirens, and you retain a lot of memory. I mean, I was quite young, but for better or for worse, those memories tend to stay with you a lot more than, say, if it was like more of an idyllic childhood. Yeah. And I have, very strange flashbacks of these episodes, and I've played it out, and it's, that's just kind of how it was. And we left as refugees, and Greece was where they took us. And I say they took us because, again, some families were able to leave under better circumstances or had other relatives elsewhere or were accepted. Actually, Iranians, when this all happened from the revolution and on, were throughout everywhere in Europe in the millions. And it just so happens that Greece is where they took us. And so we ended up in Athens, in this small town called Kalamaki, a little beach town. And, in a very strange way, despite the fact that it was in the midst of not, like really true poverty, because we kind of had to give up everything, and my father just left everything behind, and we came with really nothing except like a suitcase each. But then you kind of are by the beach, and you grow up by the ocean, and you're a child, and
Yeah.
children adjust, right? And they didn't have programming for non-native speakers, and so I just kind of they took us in and put us in Greek elementary school, and you just kind of learn the language, because again, as a child, you pick up languages and you kind of move on with it. And then finally, it took a few years for us to be able to come to the States, because we just who knows why it takes so long for immigrants to immigrate. But and we finally did land in the U.S., in Alexandria, Virginia, which
Very
really
random.
so random. I think it was because my dad had a cousin,
Okay.
like a second cousin or something.
You always go where the family
You
is.
kind of go where family is, and the Presbyterian church took us in, kind of like as a refugee family, and we ended up in Alexandria, Virginia. It was truly a culture shock, I have to say, to go from one to the other and not speaking any English. And but again, you kind of adjust and go about your life, and that's where my family settled. And my parents still live in Northern Virginia, and I grew up in Washington, D.C. And you kind of, I love telling the story, but it's a very detached story. I just tell it because thankfully, it's fine, and you kind of build your life. And I like the fact that we build our life, so we weren't really a victim of the circumstances, right? I mean, it could have turned out very differently, but since it didn't, maybe that is actually the best outcome, that you can kind of be quite neutral about it and tell it. And I'm very lucky in that I've built a life and a career that allows me to speak. So there's a platform, such as yours.
Yeah.
So you can tell the story, and it's okay. It's not, at least for me, it's not to tell it because I don't want to say that it doesn't mean anything anymore. I actually mean this in a very positive way. It's a good story to tell, but luckily I've moved on from it, and you build a different life. But it does echo such a bigger thing that happened. It does echo a big political shift. It does echo, social, political, and global, political changes. It does echo. Look at the price we're all paying. All the things that have happened since throughout the Middle East, and the involvement of Western nations, and so it kind of speaks of a bigger thing. And I think that's actually why it's okay to tell the story.
Yeah.
It's less about me, and it's more of it's a bigger narrative. And that's kind of how it started, and that's where I grew up, and that was the story.
Yeah, that's exactly why I wanted to touch on that, because I feel like, and especially even for me, because I'm also an immigrant in this country, I think it's important to show how all of us build our careers and like how we get to New York, first of all, because a lot of people who work in the arts in New York aren't from here. And, as much as, like you said, now we can tell the story like kind of a little bit detached from it, but I feel like experiences like that creep into your life when you're older, no matter what you do. And like I see it for myself also. The way that I look at art or the way that I approach things is also reinforced with a lot of things that I had to go through in like my childhood and things like that. So that's why I wanted to bring up that story. And also ask you how you got to New York.
So that's also a great question.
Yeah.
So I studied, I grew up in Virginia, went to school there. I went to George Mason University. I studied international studies, politics actually. And
So
my second degree was in Latin American literature, Spanish. So I almost simultaneously learned Spanish as I learned English, a few years later.
How many languages do you speak?
Well, I wish I could declare that I speak all these languages fluently, but I have to say, lack of practice means that you just don't. And that is, maybe I'll come back in another time to your show and declare to the audience that I have, practiced better my languages. But so I speak Farsi, I speak English, and my Spanish is not fluent anymore, but I do speak Spanish, pretty well because I studied it for all these years. But my background was that's what I studied, frankly, because I didn't know what else to study. I'll be very honest. I didn't have the right mentors to say, what do you do what do you do when you come from this background? You feel very different. You're very creative. You're an abstract thinker, and you don't necessarily want to make art, but you want to engage in abstract theory. And I can assure you, no one was kind of navigating that for me.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I was quite drawn to politics, and I still am. And it almost seemed very natural for me to want to further pursue that. Of course, part of it living in Washington, D.C., and, politics is just such a big industry and being exposed to it. But the other side of it was I just really love world affairs. It's not about that I'm a history buff, but I just really love political affairs and understanding like the political nuances of the world. And so that's what I studied. And the Spanish with the literature is because I've just always been drawn to art and culture. It has really been to the core of what I've been drawn to my entire life. But again, I just wasn't given the tools to navigate early on. Having said that, interestingly enough, my first internship out of college was for the cultural attaché at the embassy in El Salvador.
Oh, okay.
And it actually did a full circle because I ended up traveling to El Salvador, working with artists on the ground. But at the time, I just was doing, kind of whatever I needed to kind of understand. And I didn't really want to go into politics. I think by the time I actually left, university, I'm like, yeah, I don't really want to do that. And it took a few more years of kind of meandering to understand how to do what I wanted to do. But I went into media. So I worked for like local magazines in Washington. And, this is a while ago, so it wasn't as if there was all of this resources available. So I worked for local like lifestyle publications, which is, and from there, at the time, Niche Media was launching Capital File magazine. And I remember thinking, well, if they're launching and they don't come for me, given that there's probably 3 of us in town that do this, I'll be very offended. But at the same time, I was really ready to move to New York. And the thing with moving to New York was obviously I would visit New York and I would go. And that was simultaneous to when I started discovering house music, actually.
Okay.
Which I heard it, and we can kind of come back to that. But because it was all at the same time, I heard it, and I remember it changed my life. And I don't know why, but it was just this sound was incredible. And I remember thinking, I think my life is going to be tied into this. I don't quite know why, but I think it will be. And it was the same with kind of experiencing contemporary art at that time. I wasn't necessarily exposed to it from childhood, but as Persians, culture and music and art is so important, which is the irony of it, because it's the thing that the regime is like taking away, but also like kills you for it. But so I grew up in a very cultural household where music especially was prevalent, where the arts were always spoken about, where cinema, my dad and the singers that to this day, I listen to these singers from like generations ago. And it's like, what am I like? I have, I'm like, imagine being a young kid and instead of listening to like contemporary music, I'm like listening to these guys who were like 70 at the time, was in their 70s, like singing these ballads. But so I grew up in a very culturally rich household, despite all the violence, because we just grew up with so much violence and confusion. And, I can't imagine what my parents went through to like have everything yanked from you in such a hostile and violent way. But you also have to raise 2 kids that ideally you keep them alive. and that your kids don't become so traumatized where they become like, I don't know, hardened criminals, or God forbid they like die or something. And I say this not because I want to kind of say it in a sensational way, but it's because it happened. There's we know friends and acquaintances, and so I can't imagine what that life was like for them. But I'm very grateful, and I think one of the things my dad said was I was quite a opinionated kid. This might shock you and shock the listeners, but I was quite opinionated and performative kid. And I have, when I was in school, when essentially you're just a child and then you're forced, I think because I was already in first grade then, and you have to cover up. So imagine a first grader that has to now cover up because, I don't know, it's the law. But I would I would like mock it, and I thought it was funny. And it was one of the things where my father thought he has to get us out because he thought that I would not last, that I would get myself killed because I would be very outspoken and just like this wild child. And so, kind of going back to it, I grew up in a very kind of culturally rich household, but I wasn't like formally exposed to it. And so when I first discovered contemporary art, that too, I knew my life was going to be tied to it. And I didn't know quite yet how. And so by the time I just realized my story just weaved from decades, I apologize. But so by the time Niche Media was launching, they did come for me and they did ask me to help launch the publication. And I was like, well, I'm ready to go to New York. This is not for me. And being in New York was very important because I felt that my life kind of depended on it, that it was really the only home that I would have, because you just don't belong when you have a background like mine. And artists talk about it, right?
Yeah.
That this sense of outsider, you never fully belong anywhere, and you never will, because I certainly don't belong in Iran because that's not my home.
Yeah.
It's my heritage. I certainly don't belong in Greece because it was just a snapshot of a childhood. I certainly did not belong in where I grew up, which was, in the Washington, D.C. metro area, because it was just by coincidence we were thrown in there. It was not a town that I identified with or even felt any sense of connection to. And so it was really for me, New York. I knew that that's where I needed to be. And I felt that I only really started my life when I got here in a true sense of like taking ownership of who I am as a human being and the work that I wanted to do. It was really deeply tied into being in a city like this that I think allows for people like me to function. And so basically the deal was that I would launch the publication. There was 5 issues. And it was a team of us, obviously. When I say I would launch it, it wasn't like me just by myself, but it was just, we were part of a very critical team that worked at Niche and launched Capital File. And it was a very politically oriented publication. So, Wolf Blitzer was a contributor, and so were many of the ambassadors. And Ron Silver, the actor,
Wow.
who was at the time really quite politically active. He was one of the founders of I believe it was called Creative Coalition. It was like a very from the entertainment, Hollywood entertainment, that were really looking to push policies. And since things were not so hostile then, it was not received in a bad way. But by then it was also like when the Iraq invasion had happened, and like post 9/11, and it was, with Bush. And so Ron Silver was very politically involved, and he was a big contributor of the magazine. And I met him, and he said, you need to be in New York. I'm like, I know, but I have to launch the magazine. And so everybody kind of conspired and brought me on to New York. And so that's how I got to New York, with Niche Media, to kind of work for the headquarters of the publications. And that in itself was also quite intriguing, because it was at a time where local publications were not as big. It was groundbreaking, and I knew that. And I knew it when I first encountered like a publication like Ocean Drive. I was like, this is the future. This is the future of media, that it's not just these like broad publications, because this is also a little bit pre-internet, so it wasn't like everything was online, so print was king, right?
Yeah.
So I was like, no, this is also, advertisers have to reach their luxury advertisers, or content creative, cultural content. You have to speak to the audience directly. It can all be national publications. And so even then, it really was the beginning of my career to always kind of be in these things that were not necessarily ahead of their time, but it was pushing forward what was next. And I've always had an instinct for that. I've always had a deep understanding at the core. Doesn't mean I always knew how to vocalize it, speak of it. And so that's kind of how it all started. That's kind of how I got to New York. And Ron Silver and his family were incredible in kind of being very supportive of me being in New York. And then I worked at Niche Media for a couple of years. And that's, that was really, in a way, the beginning of my life. And then by 2008, things were really shifting, not just because of the financial scenario, but before that, early in this year, where it was still other disciplines had really taken on with being online, and what does it mean to be online, and what does it mean to run your like business. But art was not, art, it's still my God, it's still so behind. Like to even
Yes.
talk about this in 2024. But really, in 2008, to think of like art being online, it was like offensive to people. And so Hans Nunderhoff and Bill Fine, who were at ArtNet at the time, and I knew by the time I got to New York, kind of 2 years into, paying my dues in that media landscape that was not pure art, that I needed to shift. But I always knew that my, from what I had studied and from the work that I did, for publications, that I wanted to be deep in art, not broad,
Yeah.
but deep in art. And so
Right at the
ArtNet,
center.
right at the center of it. And ArtNet just seemed like the right thing to do. Why? Because it was online and everyone thought it was ridiculous. Like, why would it be online? Why would galleries be online? And it was like, the divine intervention. And so that's where I started my career. But not just me. I think if you think about all the alumni of ArtNet, there is many of us. As a matter of fact, we should probably do like a reunion or kind of
the ArtNet reunion.
The ArtNet reunion. Actually, the 30th anniversary of ArtNet, which was a few years before pandemic, it was great because it kind of touches upon how ahead of the time they were. And by then, Walter Robinson was the editor of the online magazine, already like I think 5-6 years into it. And it was not necessarily well received, which I find very shocking when you think about it. And so that's kind of how it started. And that's how I got to New York. And, I would say I owe it to Niche Media, to Ron Silver, to Jason Bin, to ArtNet. It was a really riveting, and also at the crossroads of media, art, online. It was all great. Like the early 2000s were like a really rich time to get into this world, and pay your dues all the way through the first decade of 2000, which is kind of what my trajectory was. And I loved it. I wouldn't have it any other way. As a matter of fact, I think if I tried to do that now, my God, no, it's a different playing field now.
But when you were at ArtNet, you were writing this interesting column about the evolution of the art market in the Middle East, which is ahead of its time at that time.
Yes, I can proudly now. I mean, obviously, it's taken this long to step back and look at it, and I wouldn't necessarily so confidently say it because you feel self-conscious, but others in the business told me how ahead of its time it was, and that's, I guess, in a way, I don't necessarily, it's not like I'm being so humble, but
toot your own horn. Go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. But that gave me the confidence to actually revisit it in a more, again, I don't want to use the word detached, but to actually talk about it and say, no, let's address this because I think it's important, and it's just important, like, in the trajectory of like the art world and my career. But yes, it really was, because at the same time, it also wasn't, because it was already there. It wasn't like I unearthed this thing that didn't, exist. I just put a spotlight on something that was happening. And that's also important to acknowledge. It was a really thriving, fascinating world. It just was a disconnect. And that's the thing. I just was noticing it like, well, I'm in New York, the center of the art world. I'm working for, a highly regarded, respectable, entity. And it just felt like there was a disconnect. And I kept going around going, does anyone else see this? Like, are we paying attention? This is really worth paying attention. And that also coincided, and which is always the case. I think anytime you look at these developing markets, it's not like this isolated incident. It's because it speaks of the world at large, of what's happening politically, economically, socially. And probably this is where my background comes in, where I have always looked at things from a political, cultural, social, economical standpoint. And I just, one should probably be well read, so you should read as well.
Yes.
We can't, we must be always, we can't thrive on our ignorance, right? We have to, we can't be proud of our ignorance. We have to constantly challenge ourselves. And so what was happening at that time, which was, I guess, around 2009-10, is that simultaneous to the Gulf states and their development and their investment in development of like economical development and cultural development, but also drawing the new lines of the new Middle East with, UAE. Saudi was still a little bit earlier because Saudi happened later, but Bahrain, Kuwait, all of that, but then also the political turmoils of Egypt and Lebanon. So this is all what was happening. So I guess the point is that it was way bigger than me or us or in like the art world. Forgot.
Yeah.
Tiny art world. This was a bigger thing that was happening. And you have the Iranians who, because of all the sanctions that have been going on since the hostage revolution in the 80s, that you can't really do direct business with Iran, but the community and the expat community in Dubai that was there, and there was this development. So it was giving into art galleries and artists. And when you think of like Iranian artists, it's not as if it's a new phenomenon. We're talking like thousands of years of culture. So of course that evolves into modernism and then contemporary. And then there's artists who are working in Iran or living in Iran, but also traveling. So this was all, and then with the Arab art, the Middle East artists. So it was just this big, ginormous thing that was happening. It just wasn't a spotlight on it per se. And so to me, that was very important because I was working at ArtNet. I was working on the gallery network side, and I just really wanted to tap into it because, obviously. And so I loved it. And the reason why I think I was given the leeway to do all these things is because nobody actually cared. It just wasn't important. It wasn't perceived as important enough, right? So it was like, okay, sure, like this is what you want to do. And I started traveling, and I started going on these incredible press trips. And I owe so much to ArtNet and Walter Robinson and like kind of ArtNet News, or well, it's ArtNet News now, but ArtNet Magazine, that to kind of allow me to write and publish these reports where I was on the ground, incredible access, watching what was developing. And by the way, it wasn't as if I was like a lone ranger. This is also early investment with like some of the big galleries, like going to Abu Dhabi, going to Dubai.
Yeah.
So it was like Gagosian and Aquavella and David Zwirner. So Jeff Koons. But believe it or not, we were all there at the same time. And it was like this small club. And I remember Sarayat Island was first being built. And I looked up at the construction crane while I'm in the ocean, and it's November, so I'm definitely in the ocean because it's freezing back in New York. And I remember thinking, pay attention, be in the moment, because this is a critical moment in all of these things, politically, culturally, art world, my career, all of it. And it was incredible. I am so proud of that time and being kind of part of it, and also looking at it through a bigger lens, and which I hope translated to actually being in a way, in presenting it in a thoughtful way. And I went back and reread my reports, and I am actually quite proud of it. They were nuanced. They highlighted things. I even talked about, if you look at the model of cultural diplomacy in the Middle East, it was really started in Iran with the Empress and pre-revolution, and that has its own challenges because think about how fraught it was and why the revolution happened. And that is definitely a different podcast. We will not go into that.
We don't have enough time for that.
We do not have, this is not a 7-episode podcast interview with me. And so it really did actually start like in the early 70s in Iran, kind of like the Shiraz Art Fair and the Tehran Contemporary Museum, and commissioning Andy Warhol and the collection of Judd and Warhol and de Kooning. And so it was to observe that, where you fast forward all these decades later and seeing it happening kind of throughout the Gulf states. And that was like, I think I was able to bring that perspective. Or having Tony Shafrazi be an exhibitor where he had the 3 portraits of the royal family by Warhol exhibited was honestly one of the most powerful moments. And I captured that and I wrote about it and I addressed it. And I think it would have been lost, I think, unless you really bring that perspective. Maybe all of this would have just been like a snapshot and you move on. And so I was quite proud of that. It was a wonderful time. I wish, but everything has its moment. So that was that moment. It's recreating it is not possible, right? Because things changed. There was a bigger, the art world started actually, thankfully, like really big support in the Middle East with, the Abu Dhabi art fair, the Art Dubai, and the wonderful galleries such as Third Line. I mean, all of that has been its own ecosystem for a very long time. And while it's nice to put a spotlight on it, does it even necessary? Because it's a wonderful world that it's operating, on its own.
Yeah.
And the artists are doing really big, wonderful work. So that's kind of how those were. So thank you for bringing that up. And the reports. Thank you.
So you've left ArtNet. Where did you go after ArtNet?
Well, I was still at ArtNet when I started Art Middle East, and that was really an initiative that I started.
So you started that while you were working at ArtNet?
Yes.
Okay.
I think so. I think my timeline is getting me confused, but yes, because it was really an initiative that I started. And that honestly, like, it's so funny. You can only do those things when A, you have no idea what you're doing, and B, when you're kind of just like young and idealistic, and again, when you really have just no idea what you're doing. That's probably the best way to do things.
But that's when great things happen.
Yeah, but it also means that you get a lot of resistance,
and
of course. People just like want to like come after you as if you're like, I don't know,
reinventing the wheel,
like, or committing a crime or something. But basically, my idea was, well, there's so many. Why isn't there an art fair that's devoted to galleries from the Middle East? And then it was, well, actually, like, I just, the Armory show was the fair. It was amazing. I mean, again, you're talking like kind of that timeline. It was fantastic. And I'm like, why aren't there programmings? Because, at the time you would get the booklet. And what's funny is how much things evolve so quickly with the digital age, because I'm telling the story, you would think it's like from 50 years ago. And we're only talking like, like
but
a decade.
But the art world was slow with technology.
But we're only talking about a decade. I mean, like, I haven't been doing this that long. I just want to like point it out, like, having this nostalgic story. But, there was the booklets. You had the booklets. There was the VIP card that was sent to you. And it was just like, well, what about if it's programming that is centered around it? And I kind of went in full force. And the only thing was what was important for me was to highlight what was happening with, like, say, and it's such a broad umbrella to say Middle East, but look, you had to you have to put a kind of a wider cloth over it, because how else are you going to do this as one person and like a handful of programming during, Armory show? So you have to be pragmatic and take it with a grain of salt. That are you really covering an entire, region of the world? But let's just give it the benefit of the doubt and say that that's what it was called. But it was actually, for me, it was important because I'm not there, right? I'm here. Like, so it was important to actually highlight those players that were part of the global stage and part of the New York art scene and part of like the more international scene, because it wasn't my place to go and like tap into a world that I'm not part of. Like, that's not respectful of an entire ecosystem. And so that's what I did. They were incredible collectors in New York who had been building these great collections that included Middle Eastern and Iranian artists. And I simply wanted to highlight it. And what was funny is like the questions, oh, they're collectors in New York that do this? I'm like, yes, as a matter of fact. And they're incredible members of society, like, successful. And so that's really how it started. And I loved it. It was wonderful programming. It was studio visits. So Ahmed Al-Sudani, Nabil Nahas, YZ Kami, and they were all so kind in allowing, because these are not small names, okay?
No,
I just would like to point out that is, that's how we started with a bang. And, with the collection visits, they were incredible collectors who generously opened their home for the collection visits. That would be part of the, and then there were panels. And so I was very proud of the panels that I put together, because the participants at the time were Kamruz Aram, Diana Al-Hadid, Thaddeus Ropak, Andre Sper-Semler, Ahmed Mater, Ahmed Al-Sudani, who was about to represent Iraq in the Venice Biennale. So they were all important names who went on to have really powerful international careers, but who were supportive of me to do that. I was very happy that they believed in this mission, but also in me recognizing, I think, the work that they were doing, because they went on to become quite, big names. And so, like, probably why you should listen to me when I say look into an artist. Like my track record is great. So it was really wonderful. I was really, really proud of that in kind of doing it. And they're friend, Ali Banisat, they're all friendships and professional relationships that have been incredible. And so, the programming lasted for 2 years and it was great. But again, everything has a timing and it wasn't necessarily what I always wanted to do, but I was just very happy to do it when I did.
Mm-hmm. So after the Middle East art fair, what did you do next?
Well, it wasn't an art fair. It was like literally programming that I did kind of like in partnership with like launching it through, different art fairs. In that case, at the time, it was the Armory show. And so by then, no, that was kind of simultaneous to me working. And so by then I'm kind of interviewing. I want to kind of work in different fields. I started working at galleries. I had, a couple of gallery jobs. I liked working at galleries because, again, it goes back to working with artists. For me, I just love working with artists. I understand kind of why, it's just having truly respect for the work of an artist, but it's also the core of all of it feeds into like everything we do is centered around the work of an artist, because otherwise,
what's the point?
What is left? There is really nothing, right? Whether it's a commercial exhibit, institutional, nonprofit, it's all centered around the artist practice. And I love working with artists. I think that's probably the thing that I pride myself and value the most is the relationships I have with artists and really believing why an artist must be a working artist, why you have to shine a spotlight on the work of the artist. So that was important for me, and I wanted to, kind of get a sense of that. So I started out, with a small kind of a up-and-coming gallery that I worked at, which was fine. But I think the gallery business is tough and you have to be really devoted to it. And as we all know, it's not an easy business. And so, I would say it kind of made me realize that, okay, this is not necessary. Not everyone will be devoted to only wanting to support the artists, right? But it doesn't matter. Like once you make a decision that this is your profession and this is what you're meant to do and this is your career forever and ever, you kind of just navigate all of it. And after kind of all of these, chapters, that kind of the last gallery that I worked at was the Lehman Maupin Gallery. An incredible program, one of the best programs in the world. I mean, to this day, the bios of those artists at that time is forever ingrained in me. And I wasn't there for a very long time. I was there for about a year, I think something like that. But it made me realize that all of the ideas I had of how I want to push forward and kind of create these new paths and seeing the artist as the talent and all these other ecosystems that follow it became quite obvious that I needed to build my own practice, that I needed to build the thing that I'm trying to do instead of insisting kind of otherwise. And it was, and I think until you witness an infrastructure that is that top notch and artists of that caliber, that I think it kind of cements, because you either want to do it or you don't. And for me, it really cemented it. It was like, oh yes, this is what it's like to operate at this level, right? And this is what I aspire to. And it was fantastic. And so, I mean, I'm trying to stay as on timeline for you but it's difficult. But the long and short of it is all those chapters in, and I started my practice as an independent art advisor in January 2016. Okay. And that's kind of how it all started. And it was a very long way of telling you the story. I hope I didn't.
No, that's actually perfect, because now we're getting to the meat of it, which is your art advisory and how it actually came to be. So I assume when you were working for these galleries that you were in some sort of director sales role.
I was in sales roles. Okay. Yes. Yes. I wasn't experienced enough to be a director yet. No. I was told that not yet. So
yes. But you took that into then, starting your own advisory. So can you tell us a little bit about why, instead of working in the sales role for galleries, that you wanted to become an art advisor. So maybe giving a context for people, the difference between being, you know, a salesperson at a gallery and then being an art advisor. Because in the end, they kind of simultaneously do similar things, because you're technically pitching an artist for a collector, you know, building collections with collectors. So tell us a little bit about that.
You know, that's a really great question, because if you are devoted to your profession and you want to have a big career, there are many paths to take, right? So, of course, the natural evolution would be, well, I'm starting out, like, you know, you kind of have all these like almost startup experiences, and then you're like landing in like bigger roles. And so, yes, you would think the path is, okay, well, I like to work my way up. I want to work into, you know, a director, then a senior director, and ideally a partner. Maybe you want to open your own gallery, you know, whatever it may be, or you actually really want to, you know, grow within the system and be, you know, and become an executive, you know, in the role. And so that's very important, of course. But I think it kind of goes back to, one, I've always been very independent and entrepreneurial, and that's just how it is. And of course, you can, some of the most successful dealers are that, and, you know, gallery partners. But I also, I've just had this very diverse network and diverse way of operating, and coming from this very non-traditional background. And, you know, I have to say, in some scenarios, it was very difficult, being where you had some of the you know, some of the team members who like kind of started as an intern and have stayed on in this very lovely path.
Yep.
And have actually like stayed on in the same place, even not even like moved around, and
Yeah.
really grown and thrived and built this. And I think that's a very honorable path, but that's not for everyone.
Yep.
And it's a very different way, like different DNA and different brain kind of cells. But so for me, I realized that, and and actually I interviewed with, you know, I interviewed with like some really big, you know, galleries. I interviewed with Larry Gagosian, and who kind of was like, you know, I don't think she's really big into sales. Like, no. So,
I think you're too creative for sales.
so I think it was actually amazing, because only someone as brilliant as him can kind of see right through that very immediately. And I just have so much respect for someone who's that good at building what they have. And so for me, I just, that wasn't going to be the way I was going to thrive. It was becoming quite obvious for me that that's just not how I was going to thrive. And you know, I needed to kind of dig deeper into like, what does it mean to like really understand these ideas I want to explore. Because even then, I remember I put together this pitch for one, you know, when I wanted to get hired. I put this pitch of like, I mean, when I think about it now, I'm like, okay, great. Was, I want to bring these disciplines together. I want to treat the artist as and thankfully by then, you know, you do have things on record. So I'm not just saying it because it's literally, I have the email to back it up, where I said, you know, I want to bring kind of the worlds of electronic music and art together. I want to kind of have this different disciplines, but I wasn't saying it in this way. I was saying it at that time in much more raw terms, but that's how I was presenting myself, or why I should be part of it. And it was not very well received.
I'm shocked.
Like, I know this might seem shocking, but it just wasn't, right?
Yeah.
At that time. This is like in 14, 15, 2000, whenever it was, or even 16. And so it's okay, because then you can kind of, you realize, at least for me, I needed to carve my own path. And I'm still doing that, I must say. But that's really how it started, where I was like, no, I just love the idea that I can tap into this, and I would say my network is probably one of my biggest assets, and something I pride myself in, that I have built very naturally and organically. And it was the thing that I found that in some of my earlier jobs, like kind of, not by the end, but like some of like when I was first kind of like in, you know, the startup gallery or whatever, where it was almost wanting to be taken from me, like taken away from me. And I'm like, no, I think I have to keep digging. And I wish at the time I had more mentors to say, it's okay to have this non-traditional path, and don't force it to be like one way or another. But I didn't, and it's okay. You know, you move on. But it was very important for me to kind of have this practice that was mimicked my brain, which is not all one dimensional of I want to just do sales or I want to just work with artists. I kind of want to do both.
You want to do
And
everything.
so I want to do everything. I really do. And I always have. And it felt very, it was only when I started being exposed to these incredible people, like these incredible successful gallerists and dealers and artists and practitioners, that I'm like, this is very inspiring, but I want to do it for myself. And that was probably, and that was kind of going back to when I saw how I just like the respect I had for the program at Lehman Maupin. I was like, this is what one should aim for at all times, like this kind of level of excellence in artists. And that's how I started. And I started working as an art advisor, and like literally little by little. I mean, it has not been an easy path. And not only has it not been an easy path, but I kept trying to change the path, like not change as in like shift, but I kept wanting to grow it and expand it. So I don't allow myself to rest. Like I just kept pushing. And in between that, I started working with Ahmed Mater, who's a Saudi artist, incredible photographer, conceptual theorist, brilliant chronicler of our time. And that was an incredible experience. And that was, years and years before, obviously, the shift and the focus and all these developments that are happening in Saudi. And I remember seeing his work in Istanbul. I think it was 2012. It was like an Edge of Arabia exhibit, and it was a group show, but I saw Ahmed's work, and I knew immediately, one, that he was going to be one of like the great artists, and two, that somehow I would be, my career would be involved, like our paths would be together. And it was really rewarding because his work has just been really incredible.
Yeah.
And so I got to work with him in the capacity where I was a little bit like a, like with and also with Edge of Arabia, like it was like all working together, where I was kind of like the US person, if you will. So I placed his work in incredible collections, and including institutional. And so that was also, that was probably a chapter I'm so proud of, not just because I respect him so much as an artist, but watching the trajectory of his career take off has been incredible. And it kind of goes back to like, if I just stick to the path of believing in the artist that I believe in, and my instincts in understanding what makes an artist great, which is my biggest asset. It's the thing that, honestly, I think you're probably born with something like that, but then you better hone it a lot. But probably it's something that maybe I had to go through all this, but that is the thing, right? Like in spotting great artists,
Spotting great talent.
And it's really was full circle to kind of do that work, and it reiterated of why I want to do what I do.
Yeah.
To kind of work that way.
Well, you've dedicated your entire career in working with artists like Ahmed Mater, Shirin Neshat, Carl Craig, Paula Peavy. Like, these are incredible big artists. And I know you've also mentioned that you've placed a lot of works in huge institutional collections like the Met, Guggenheim, Dia. Can you tell us a little bit about how you like to approach the way you work with artists?
Yes, I mean, all wonderful artists and all in different ways. It's funny, you mentioned it, that there's this kind of like connection. I think, I'll start with Shirin Neshat first because she's just someone I truly admire.
Yeah.
And I wish I could say I've worked with her in a bigger capacity, but we haven't yet. Maybe in the future we will.
Well, you were also part of her portrait series, which I want to get into.
Yes.
Because one day I walked into the gallery and I saw your portrait there, and I was like, what?
I did. But, with Shirin, she's just truly an artist that has been a source of inspiration for me in her practice, because she speaks of these things that her work, why it is so, why it resonated on a global scale. Just like any great artist, is the personal becomes it resonates with the world. And her, as an Iranian woman who expressed what happened to her culture, to her land. I always believe artists can speak for us, and artists can speak of the greats and the horrors of our time.
Yeah.
And she's just someone that spoke to that in a way and allowed me to say, you know what, I do want to pursue this path. That if someone like her, and I'm not the only one that says that, like there are other artists who have said in studying her work, it allowed them to maybe pursue a career or actually allow them to say, well, if she can talk about these subjects, then maybe I can. And I know you have a connection with her.
Oh yeah, I
right?
love her work. Yeah, I did. I wrote my graduate thesis on her
Amazing.
work. And it's weird because obviously I have no connection to Iran whatsoever, but when I saw her work, it was so powerful that something in it really personally resonated with me as a woman. And I was like, I have to study her further. I have to write my thesis on her. She's absolutely incredible.
Yeah, it is what all great artists do, right? Like, yes, yeah, exactly. You don't, yes, of course, as someone who's from Iran and can relate to it, but that's not what made her the global
Sensation
international
she is, yeah.
sensation that she is, wasn't because of just that. And so that's probably why it also for you and your background, it just resonated at a deeper level. So with Shireen, yes, I hope in the future we can actually work on a major project together. But in that time, I'm very lucky in that I know her. She inspires me. We've done obviously some work together, which has been great. And then, yes, of course, the portrait. I'm happy you brought that up because that, I just feel like that's one of those things that the universe just aligned, and I will look back at this decades from now and it'll be my pride and joy
Yeah.
that, you know, that's me in there. I know you don't
I would
recognize
have that
me.
portrait on full display in my house for everyone to see every time they come in.
I do actually.
Okay, good.
So no, that was really an incredible time because it was and again, it's almost and I say, and I use I hope my use of the word detach is not in a bad way. I mean it in almost like you kind of have to step away and see it in the bigger
Right.
picture. And that was just simply an honor because the series Book of Kings was really about, you know, her as an artist tackling these political issues and sense of identity and displacement and, you know, the more modern political turmoils that were happening at the time. And to be one of the subjects is just fascinating because it's not about you anymore, right?
Yeah.
I mean, literally, you're one more person who just gets lost into this universe through her eyes. And even when I look at it, I mean, of course, yes, it's great. And it's like, you know, the bragging that goes with it, but it's not you anymore. You just happen to be part of this greater narrative. And I'm just very happy about. And it's just that I'm very grateful to artists like her for doing the work that they do, because I think it allows those that want to maybe deal with their own life issues and identity, and also inspiring others to become artists maybe, or to become, you know, so it's a much bigger kind of level,
Yeah.
you know, with her. And, you know, Paola Peavy, she's an artist, another powerful, strong woman who I respect so much. And her career and her, you know, practice in getting to know her and how disciplined she is, and the way she honors her vision. And you know, our hope is that we will work on a great project together in the future. I mean, we put a couple of years of work into this. It's just a matter of seeing how it will be realized.
Yeah.
Which hopefully I can talk about, you know, later on.
I was going to say, I'm like, can you spill some details for any future projects you have going on with artists?
You know, no,
Okay.
because it's, you know, not because I don't want to, but it's really not about
It's still in the
me,
works.
you
Yeah.
know, it's about kind of honoring the process. And that's the other thing. I love sitting here with you and telling these stories, but you know, it's never about you know, it's not a single narrative. Like there's an entire ecosystem that's behind it. So while it makes for great conversation to be like, yes, me and Paula, but it's, you know, there's a bigger kind of entity that goes
Right.
behind in bringing this work. And that's probably the biggest pleasure in having my own business and in aiming for the work that I do, is that I get to work with the best of the best in the business. And that is something I have made a conscious effort in doing. It's not always easy and it's not always balanced, because I am a small entity that you kind of have to deliver at the same level as like the big entities. But as an example, I have really, since I went on my own, been working very closely with Paratine Gallery. I think they have one of the best programs in the world. And
they also represent Paula, no?
they represent Paola Peavy amongst other incredible artists. And, you know, in being able to work, closely with them as an advisor is something that I really respect and value. And it has allowed me to evolve as an advisor because you get to work with one of the best programs in the world. But it's not the only one, but it's just a great example to give. And so with an artist like Paula, yes, we're hoping to develop a project together, and it's been kind of a little bit in the making, but it's because if I believe that if that's your aim and goal, then you're very lucky in that you get to work with hopeful, with some of the best in the business. And that's for me very rewarding and very important. And it takes truly an army, but it also allows me to talk about it and put a spotlight on it. And that's probably one of the biggest privileges for me is to do that.
One thing I find really interesting about you as an art advisor, because you have a very holistic practice. So you work with collectors and building their collections. You'll work with artists and bring their programming, to fruition. Also collaborating with galleries. You do a lot of talks. You do a lot of brand partnerships and things like that. Whereas the way maybe a lot of us think about art advisors is just people who work with collectors one-on-one and build their collections, and then that's it.
Definitely. And that has been the blessing and the curse. That is probably why I had to be on my own, because I would say, while you so kindly point out how holistic this is, and yes, I'm a very much a multi-hyphenate person, but everyone likes things in a box.
Yeah.
And everyone wants things in a way that is understandable and simple and doesn't necessarily want to get into the complexity. So that has also been held against me a lot and, almost weaponized, like, oh, we can't take this seriously because it's this and this. And it's like, that actually speaks more on the other side than me, because hopefully I'm doing enough work that it can,
speak for itself.
Yes, hopefully will speak for itself. As a matter of fact, the good, the bad, the errors, it can all speak for itself, because that is what makes someone, anyone, anything what it is, right? So I think there's been thankfully now more of a shift in understanding that multi-hyphenates exist and that they're good for society.
Yeah.
They're not like bad characters, they're not out to get you. So that's shifted. We have much more better understanding. As a matter of fact, I love Athena Calderon, I Swoon. She speaks about this. And I'm like, thank God, at least someone is like speaking about it. And I think this goes back to what I said, is I realized early on that I have to build the practice that mimics my brain, because I think it's very important. I think my holistic approach and my deep understanding, and also my experience in all sides of it, right? Like I have been on the ground as a writer and covering,
journalist,
as a journalist covering the market. I have been an advisor. I have worked in the gallery. I've kind of, it's important. The only experience I haven't had, even though I do a lot of, because I do, obviously secondary work, is I never worked in an auction house, but well,
do you need that under your belt too?
But it's okay. It's fine. Like, it's not the end of the world, but, and it's just that, I've just done other things enough, but it was never, it wasn't gonna, I think, work for me to just be one thing. And it never has worked for me that way. And it never will. I think the only good thing is that I've now worked hard enough and taken enough beating to be okay with it. And I feel very good that someone such as yourself, who I respect, can see that this is a very holistic practice and that it is not there's nothing random about it. And I always say there's a method to, actually, in our business and in the creative industries, as much as it might seem otherwise, there's actually a method to the madness. And that's the other side of it, is that while I'm very much believe in honing your intuition and your eye, but so much of what I do is actually really pragmatic and logical, to a point that it like offends people. I do believe that while it's a creative business, we work in a creative industry, there's so much about trusting your instincts, honing your passion, honing your eye, but it's also a very pragmatic side of the business. Like, you have to be well read, you have to be really have a broad sense of, like I mentioned earlier, politics, economy, the markets, the bigger, the bigger cultural landscape. And in doing the work, and I think this is the thing that sometimes doesn't always come across because it's also very creative, is that there's actually quite I take very pragmatic and strategic approaches, almost like it becomes dull how approach, my approach can be so matter of fact, which is so perception wise, maybe the opposite of what I convey or like even what comes across. But I really believe that, first of all, there's a method to the madness. There's always a method to the madness. And I really believe that in all creative industries. That it is not all just like, up in the air. But also the other side of it is that you have to take very strategic, pragmatic, kind of matter of fact approach in order to let the creative side thrive. And that's probably something that doesn't always come across. And I'm told often, how passionate I am about what I do. I'm like, well, of course I am, yes, but that doesn't mean that it is also not, there's like a sobering element to doing the work. And I think that that's actually very important. And I do want to do it all. I do really see truly the full picture, and that is why I want to that is why I've prided myself in building a practice that is bringing together the market side and like the very traditional advisory side, but really also the part of working with artists on long-term projects in kind of, really meaningful and interesting collaborations, and in bringing the disciplines together. Because the visual arts, of course, it's great as a standalone. It's really one of the greatest. I mean, I can't imagine doing anything else because I truly love the art, the visual arts. But to me, the confluence of the visual arts with other disciplines, it's really quite exciting. And it is something that I've always believed in. But I would say, you can't, everything takes, you have to put in the work, right? Yeah. You have to really just put in the work and the time. And I think everything that I've done up to now, you have to pay your dues. I mean, it's not an easy thing, and no one, doesn't matter what your background is, and you can kind of start from scratch or have had every advantage, but that doesn't guarantee anything. And I really believe in that. Like, you have to put in the time and the errors, and like, I'm sure you're going to piss off a whole lot of people along the way. So I'm sorry about that, whoever I have. But at the same time, you also have a lot of people who just are resistant to you, who just, look, there's going to be people who just will not support what you're doing no matter what. And that's okay. You can't please the whole world. And, there are people where your very existence might offend them or threaten them or bother them. Or maybe you're tapping into something that others may want to actually further do. And it is okay. It is, I think all of it is okay as long as you do good work and you really believe in the artists, and you really, have great relationships and have great allies. And that's something that I am very proud of, is the relationships I've built in the art world. And, the way it kind of allows me to continue to grow and hopefully take on the next chapters. But yeah, it's a very interesting thing you bring up of like, my practice is quite multidimensional, and is that okay or not? And it hasn't always been. I know for a fact it's just, and not just me, by the way. I just mean, in it broadly speaking, it's not always well received, right? People like to force you into a box or dismiss what you're doing because it doesn't fit existing models or accepted models. And you just have to, I wish I could say ignore it, because I'm not exactly the kind that just ignores things and move on. But you do kind of have to, you just have to kind of move past it. And it's okay if you take it personally, but it's a lot of times it's probably not even really personal. Sometimes it is, but a lot of times it's not. It just means that you're on a maybe a bigger path or a different path, and you just have to kind of honor your vision, and hopefully you make those that you work with happy. But then it's also a very interesting thing, because when you have your own business, first of all, no matter what, it's a lonely business. And that is something that I didn't think about it. I'm like, why would anyone think it's a lonely business? We are so social in the art world. Like, sometimes I want to hide. Like, can I please be lonely for a second? Because it feeds so much of your like social life, because it's a very social business. I think the gallery dinner and the museum dinners are like the most incredible social experiments ever. I go to plenty of other dinners, but nothing serves the same like weird social dynamics. But it was mentioned to me by those that maybe worked kind of within bigger systems who then want to be on their own, that it can be quite lonely. And I'm like, that's an interesting observation. It probably is true because you essentially have yourself to answer to, even if you have a team, right? And, I have those that help me kind of bring my vision to life. And that's something that I would say took a while to really be able to find incredible talent to help me push my vision, because that's very difficult and they don't train you for that. And I certainly wasn't, given the right tools to do that. But it does all fall on you, right? So you kind of are the end all. So if something goes bad, it's your fault.
Yep.
If something goes good, doesn't matter. It's, it's fine. It's just one more thing. And then you can't not promote your work, because then who's going to promote your work? But then if you promote it too much, are you really, then you're just like, all you're doing is promoting your work. So it's a very weird dynamic, but you kind of have to do it anyway. And it's a strange thing, because again, any project you take on, it's an entire ecosystem that's behind it. And especially with me, I tend to work with like, either it's the artists or museums or galleries, or it's just like a big, you're working, again, like I was saying, with some of the best in the business. So it's not like you doing it. It's not like Nazy by herself, did this, but it is part of what you do. So how do you own your role and give credit for your role while still acknowledging that it's actually a bigger ecosystem, but also not hiding? And that's something I would say I used to do a lot more, where I just felt so uncomfortable taking credit for something, where I'm like, what, is it really necessary? Like, why are we like overemphasizing this? Like, it also must, this is where the pragmatic kind of comes in, where I'm like, okay, can we just maybe move on from this? But it's, I don't know. It's a tough thing to do when you work for yourself.
Yep.
Like, you want to make sure that you're talking about your skill set so that you're considered for other roles, and that there's, you're being referred for, like, or maybe thought about for future projects. But then, I've been in scenarios where, because you're affiliated with a project or with an artist, where everyone like, well, you're not the only one. I'm like, well, yes, obviously. That would be a very strange predicament if it was like a 2-person scenario. Yeah. So it is a very weird thing, but it comes with the nature of this type of business. But then also I know for a fact that I have this really incredible platform. I am asked to give my expertise. I'm asked to be on talks. And that is, I think, something that I don't take lightly at all. I'm very proud of being able to do that. And sitting here with you, I mean, I think we talked about how this was so meaningful and important for me, because I just had so much respect on what you have built and those that have been part of it. So I take it very seriously. And I think that you have to be wise about it. So if you can put a spotlight on the mission, then it's okay to do. And you shouldn't take it lightly. So I guess what I say.
I mean, that's part of the podcast and why I chose to do it, because I've seen women always in like the shadows doing all this incredible work and never wanting or never getting the chance to actually speak about the fact that they're doing all of this. And people don't realize how many wheels have to turn for one thing to actually happen in the art world, and how many people are behind it, most of whom are women. And women don't have this innate ability, or at least most women don't have this ability where they want to, like, be like, you know what, I did this. This is something, talk about themselves.
Definitely. I mean, I always compare it to filmmaking, which is very interesting, because I've actually never been involved in filmmaking, but it seems to make a great analogy. But look at what it takes to make a film, right? Look at what it takes for a podcast. I mean, really, like it takes an army, right? But you have the best cinematographer, the best director, the best screenwriter, makeup artist. But so it is kind of like that. I see myself, it's almost like it's you're making a film, and it's got a lot of cast of characters. It's just that sometimes you're going to hear about like the top 3. And that's just how it is. And other times, no. There have been plenty of projects that I've been involved in. And I think this is something you brought up when we were speaking ahead of time, where I said, I can't talk about it. And there are some really, you have to sometimes be a rainmaker behind the scenes. And I think that's the interesting part. And it's something that I think I have a very good grasp of. The things that I can put out, which is great to talk about because it's actually just very interesting and I like to talk about it. And I think it's nice to say, well, yes, I was involved in this, I was involved in that. And it speaks to a bigger picture, I think, because it says, well, these are all the things a new, like a futuristic art advisory or art practice can do. And that's really why I like to talk about these things, because I want to show that you can have an agency that is quite multidimensional and you can wear different hats and deliver many hats, especially because you're not the only one doing it. That is the other thing to emphasize. So the reason why I can do maybe this XYZ collaboration or work on a potential exhibit is because it involves a lot of others that can help realize a vision. And then there are things that you do that you absolutely needs to be behind the scenes that you do not get to have the privilege of sitting here and talking about it. And that is also okay. It comes with the territory. And like I said, I mentioned to you, I said, well, no, these we will not get into. And that's also because it's the nature of the role. You don't need to announce it, but other times it's out of privacy. Other times it's because it involves investments and, clients, and you just don't get into that. And that's okay too. But if you have a platform, if you're so lucky as to have a platform, I think you should be open and talk about it and show that, there you can have this really rewarding career in the creative industries. And probably the thing that you just brought up is with the finances, right? How do you monetize a business like this? I still don't know, by the way. Still would like to know how to monetize my business, but I've had to figure that out really on my own. Because what's interesting is not everybody wants to give you good financial advice. I've noticed that. I'm like, why are you like? It's not going to take. If I asked you,
gatekeeping,
but it's not going to take away from you, right? Like nobody's going to say, well, now that we know Carolina is not getting it because, you had to tell her, and now Nazy is getting it. But it's really not like that. That's not how it works. But, I have found that people just don't necessarily want to give you the financial advice that you need. And you kind of have to go about it on your own and learn. And there have been times where I have felt completely undervalued. And it's made me so angry that I agreed to something. And then there are times where people question the value of it. And it's not even personal. They're just questioning the value of it in general. And it's shocking to me that the value of XYZ would even get questioned. And I think that's something that we have to talk about more. And at the same time, I know many sit in seats like this and say we need to talk about it more, but is it actually happening? I don't know, because I've kind of been in these scenarios where, and this is something I'm not the only one, where I believe in the project so much, where I'm like, okay, we're just going to do it and we'll figure it out. And obviously that is not a good idea. So I do not encourage that. Please don't do that, because it's like, it's painful. But I have, and I think it's okay to do that sometimes, where if you are in the midst of negotiations or if there's a deal on the table, sometimes you have to take certain financial risks and financial sacrifices, but only to some extent, so that it's respected, because it's not always respected. And there have been times where I have wildly discounted my services because I saw it, not because I thought, I actually saw it in a very strategic way, where I thought, you know what, it is okay, because in the long term, it will pay off. There are other financial parameters around this deal or this project that will balance out. And let's take a pragmatic approach. If it means that on the front end, we have to take, a bigger discount. And I have done it, and I have been very okay with it. Because it did, I did, and because I actually look at things quite full picture and holistically, I tend to see things like, honestly, sometimes 5-6 steps ahead. And it is a blessing and a curse, because you have to now explain yourself. or people are like become almost hostile. Like, why are you even think of this? I'm like, well, that's how my brain works. But it's actually it's the other thing of my like, my secret sauce is that I tend to see scenarios like 8 folds over and all the arms and legs of it. And I see the film. I see the film delivered on the screen way ahead of time. And
Maybe
that's
you
like,
should consider playing chess.
I mean, yeah, I like playing chess, but like I can see it, it's like, oh, let's say we're talking about this one artist. And I'm like, okay, I can see this and this and this and this. And I'm already in, I'm already done and seeing it.
Yeah.
And that's something actually that is probably, um, you can't really bottle that. I wish I could, but it's the thing I bring to the table. But so I've put financial scenarios in place because I was able to see it. But I have found that if you really discount yourself too much, you can never recover from that. And that is, to me, a shame, because you should be able to recover from that, but you don't. Because a couple of things I found happens. One is, let's say I gave you, I mean, I'm obviously exaggerating, but let's say I gave you an 80%, like not a discount, but let's say I discounted, or my fee or whatnot is like at an 80%. You're not going to say, wow, this is quite honorable and I'm getting a great deal. You're going to say, I wonder if I could have gotten this for 90 or for free.
Yeah.
Right. And from then on, you're going to look almost at me as, oh, well, that's all,
she's worth.
And now let's say that the business risk is paying off and, we're putting certain parameters in place. We almost feel like, why should I even pay my part now? Like, why? So I have found that and it's not you who's the problem. It's the other side.
Yeah.
So you don't always recover well from that. At the same time, I think you have to be savvy and you have to navigate, and because all of the things I work on are so different scenarios, like how do you monetize all of that? And I think I'm very proud of that. I'm quite proud of having found proper ways to put business parameters in place without not a whole lot of like, I have some great support system, but it's a very tricky thing to fight for your worth. And also what I find is, as an advisor, and this is kind of a broader thing, where there's sometimes this misconception that the art advisor should get the least amount of compensation, but everybody else kind of gets the most amount. And we don't do that with other service providers, right? We happily pay all the other service providers, but somehow this is not one that garners a percentage, a reward, or it's like, and that to me is unacceptable, and that has to change. But I don't know if the pressure should be from this end. I think it has to be others need to kind of understand that that is not correct. That, and this is such a strange example to give, but again, like I said, you have no problem saying, well, my architect and my designer and my lawyer and my accountant I'm going to pay top dollar to get the best of the best. But sometimes it's like, well, why should the advisor also get a big percentage? Where they don't match, the compensations don't match. And I think that's a bigger issue. But obviously there are incredible advisors who I'm very close with, who are just so darn good at what they do that they are changing that narrative. And I'm very happy that they are, because I think it will have other trickle effects. And I quite respect them. But yeah, that's probably the thing. It's as everyone, but especially as women, you have to really speak up for your value, but also this idea that the arts profession has to be underpaid, and especially in the commercial side, is really a dated, like, it's just so boring to have that conversation. I'm like, we can't still be here. Like, please, are we really still having this conversation?
Have you seen that article that just came out? I think it was on Art News, about how underpaid artists and the art industry is, but we're some of the most overeducated people.
Yes.
I mean, this is something we've all known working behind the scenes, but just to see the actual numbers, I was like, why are we still here?
I don't know why we're still here, because I think actually, first of all, I think in the art world, there are so many, and that is probably the one thing I have to say. This is a really great woman-centric industry.
Yes.
I mean, I would say 90% of those I work with are women.
Same.
I think I would have to like if I said I want to work with more men, I would have to put a lot of effort. Like I'm like, how do I even do that? Having said that, of course, I work with really great men, but it is a very woman-centric business, and women do sit at the top of the food chain in many aspects, but not in all. And I'm not talking about actual statistics, because we know if we actually were to look at actual statistics of museum directors and auction house leaders and gallery, and, gallerists and artists. So let's take the actual stats out of the way, but it is a very woman-centric business. And I think that's fantastic. And so in a way, though, it means that we as women have to then address these issues ourselves. And sometimes I find that what happens is, how do I say this? There's a great narrative of women supporting women, of course, but sometimes that's just the narrative. Women say they're going to support each other, but do they always?
I've had a few guests who have had the same statement, saying that sometimes the people who are actually in their way were women.
Yes, like that is definitely something, like, let's be honest. That is something that also needs to be addressed. That it is one thing to talk the talk, but it is not always being, happening. And I would say, yes, there have probably that, like to your point, you said others said that there were women that got in their way. That's probably very much true. I have to say that at that point you don't even, you become kind of like neutral to the scenario. But it is a fact. Like, you can say that you are a supporter of all women, but when it comes down to it, you might actually feel threatened, or you feel like it's gonna be taken away from your pie, when it's really not the case. And so that is, I think, something that just has to be addressed. So I think it is important to, first of all, I think we all need to support each other, man, woman. It's just in our industry, right? Like I think it is a very personal industry, so we have to do that. But at the same time, kind of the narrative of, look, not every woman will support you because simply they or you are a woman. And that's just a fact. Like, there are going to be those who will get in your way, or who feel threatened by you, or who are bringing in maybe just some of their own issues, like personal issues has nothing to do with you, their own shortcomings, their own jealousy, their own, personal issues. And that's just how it is. And I think we have to be, aware of that it is one thing for all of us. And now we talk more about, women supporting each other, but that's not always going to be the case. And that is okay, as long as you can build a great network of supporters and you can do the same for others. And that's something I believe in. I think I love supporting friends and connecting friends and being a rainmaker and just like really putting things in motion that might support others. I think it's fantastic. Like, why wouldn't you want to do that if that's the case? And this idea that everyone is a threat or everyone is a competition, it just seems so boring and uninspiring. And, it's like, why? Why doesn't have to? But, I have been in scenarios. I mean, I'll never forget where, I have been told that sometimes I need to maybe curb my bluntness, and maybe I'll work on it.
I love blunt people. Please do not ever curb your bluntness.
And at the same time, I have been so diplomatic where it has been to no one's benefit. Certainly not mine, or actually no one's. And I have to kind of find a balance between, the being very diplomatic to being to the opposite end of it. But I remember sitting in a meeting and this person just, when you just know you're not dealing with logic. And I find that the minute I am in that scenario, because as someone who is truly loves logic, even if I hate the scenario, if you present me with enough logic, I might hate it, but I'll probably agree, because it's kind of hard to common sense and logic. And on the opposite end of it, I have sat across people where no matter what you say or do, or no matter what the scenario is, there's just no reasoning. And when that happens, I just have to walk away from a scenario. And I remember sitting in a meeting with someone, and this woman was just, having their own personal issues, had nothing to do with me. And I finally said, I think this scenario, the issue is that my mere existence will be a problem for this person. And when I said it, I was like, oh, I don't usually say things this way. But it was really good to say it, because sometimes that's just the case where it has nothing to do with you changing your ways, or you being, addressing things, or you addressing things a certain way, where it's simply your existence will not sit well with this other person.
Of course.
And you just have to, very quietly, or maybe sometimes not so quietly, just you gotta remove yourself from that scenario, because you're just setting yourself up for a disaster. But that just all comes with the territory. I mean, it's nice to talk about it, but it's fine. It's not like nothing that anyone else doesn't deal with in every other industry.
Yeah.
But, we do have to be supportive of each other. I think we're all in it I think most of us are in it for the right reason. So,
I mean, you kind of already touched upon this, but I wanted to ask you if there's a specific situation that you want to talk about, if you've had any challenges as a woman in this industry.
That's a great question, because it actually, it goes back to, this is a very woman-centric business that we're in, our industry. So I can't say a scenario stands out where it was because I'm a woman, but there's other layers to that. Couple of things. One, because I think of myself as, I'm a very creative person, but also I have built my practice around more of the creative, the visual arts side of it, and less about like, this is all about market and investment. But I was also quite well trained in the market at ArtNet, and I'm very, understanding like what makes an artist have long-term career goals. But typically I would say, so it's less about being a woman and more about just other prejudices that goes in our business. And I would say that probably clients who really want to view collecting as an investment will wrongly not come to me, because they think I'm so focused on the creative side. And I say very wrongly, because I'm very good about the market, and that is how we've been able to build collections. And I actually put my money where my mouth is. My own collection, which has been truly based on artists that I love and work, has all done, they're all incredible artists. But so I would say there are more other prejudices that comes in the business, where it's like, oh, well, you're not looking at it, as a purely market, investment. And it's like, no, as a matter of fact, we're looking at this in building you a really nice collection that will have great legacy and value.
Yeah.
And let's not forget that. And as a matter of fact, only someone who's so deep in the ground and like has their, has a pulse and has this connection with the artist and with the primary and secondary market can give you the kind of advice that you want. But you might you might instead go to someone who's like more of a corporate. You're going to go to a corporate guy because he's going to speak your language, and you're like, yeah, look what I got. And I have had that. And with some, where when the relationship was a little bit more personal, I've actually said it, because it was less of a professional relationship. It was like, this guy where I said, yeah, because you listened to that financial advisor guy of yours who told you to go get, this artist, and where is he now? But if you had listened to me, it would be. So there's other prejudices that kind of come with it. And part of it is probably because, yes, I'm a woman, I'm a creative, I'm in the creative business. I look at it purely from a creative side. And so it's going to maybe not be looked at as well, are these going to be like really investment, which I think it's quite foolish, to be honest.
Yeah.
And then there are probably other prejudices where, and that's just, given my background, given that I'm quite vocal about my background, that, there are probably other prejudices. I mean, I probably should have, not for any reason, not certainly for naming names, because I find that actually boring, but just for like comical to revisit the statements. I meant to like take notes of some of the more ignorant kind of ignorance that is centered around other markets or other, other cultures or other, looking at artists from other, So I would say those probably have been the more of what I've experienced. Or, as imagine doing Art Middle East in 2009. I really wish I had written down some of the comical commentary, because it would make for great, we would be laughing and crying probably at the same time in 2024. So I would say those, yes, they have been. And really, when you work independently, people don't respect always that you're working independently because they think you're just like, get up and every now and then do something. And that, I have to say, is where people will probably get the rudest awakening, that as a matter of fact, everything is on you. You don't have a travel budget. You don't have an expense account. You don't have a salary. You don't have insurance. You have to build all that into going and putting the money right back into, the money that you make. That is not always a stable, it comes and depends on who's paying. I mean, you're on some retainer, but some not. But that to me is, and it's not just geared towards me. It's not like Nazi got singled out. This is more of just like a broader prejudices that come with those who work independently.
Yeah.
And I have found that because there's always, sometimes it's not balanced because you're sitting in a room with those who are like much more like corporate or industry, like organizations. And so the balance is not always there. And to me, that's probably, I would say, where the biggest misconception comes. Or, if you think that maybe because you have like, you have got 10 really great connections and you were able to like make 2 sales, that then this is now your profession. And that is probably where the rudest awakening comes. To actually do this consistently, long term, ongoing, to then be at the forefront of things or to want to evolve or grow and not, it is not easy.
Yeah.
And that is probably the thing that gets very lost in the shuffle, that, you're just, and I think if you do it with a bit of creativity and style, people really get offended by that. Like they think like, oh, this can't be serious. And it's like, oh my God, are you in for a shock? Because it's the opposite. But I really believe that, like, if you really do things with flair and style and the creative eye first, that is not, you're not always like embraced with like a big hug. You know, it's so I would say, it's that to me is, I find it foolish and comical to underestimate what it takes to work independently and to do it for a long time and to continue to do it. It's that's probably the biggest prejudices. And then I think that being a woman, I think it gets so ingrained that you probably don't realize it anymore. I think women judge other women. You can. It's not just being judged as a woman by other, by men. I think it's just, it's for better or for worse. It's all probably just so ingrained that we don't even notice it anymore. I find that I don't even entertain. I tend to, if I get a sense that I'm about to face something that at that level of, I just can't suffer fools. I just like walk away. I'm like, this is going to waste my time. Forget it. Like, we're not even going to engage. But also you have to have good instincts, right? You have to understand that not everybody's a good egg. So you have to kind of, be careful. Be careful out there.
You know what I think a big misconception is, and I think it's because art advisors tend to be freelancers. I've met a lot of art advisors who literally just do get up whenever they feel like it. They have maybe 1 or 2 collectors that they work with. They're usually, from like a wealthy family background and things like that. So they have a very kind of like nonchalant attitudes towards their job. And I think that also discredits a lot of the art advisors who really put their all into their work, who work nonstop, and who are very passionate about what they do.
But yes, of course, every time there's a bad character that like speaks, that will cause harm for an industry. But if you read about if there are 5 bad artists, do you now dismiss every artist that they're all artists must now go away? Or, I mean, there's some gallerists who are, in trouble right now. But do we shut down all art galleries or museums? I mean, we all know museums are going through a reckoning right now. But do you invalidate every single museum director and museum and the program? No, of course not. And by the way, if the way you choose to work is you want to look after 2 clients and look after them well, and that is the way you want to work, then you should absolutely be able to do that. Like, who are we to even question that? As long as there's nobody's, not doing bad things, but that, that is the whole point of working as a freelance, right? A freelance writer, some writers maybe get up and work, go in a cabin and lock themselves up, or like work, write for X hours, or someone else, has a different style of doing it. But they can be different levels of business, right? Like,
Yeah.
and that is, it should be okay. But to kind of blanket want to do that, I find it's just, it speaks more of the other
Yeah.
side than anything. But yeah, it comes with all that. I would say, you name it, I've probably experienced it in as far as like prejudices or judgments or, misconceptions. And actually, what might be great is that as we're sitting here, I actually can't even come up. The good thing is that
You forget it.
you forget it enough that, like, even right now, I can't be like, well, this one
Yeah.
incident stood out for me, a lot. But maybe that's just me blocking it all.
You're like trauma blocked.
It's all blocked trauma.
But speaking of art advisors and clients, I kind of also wanted to touch on the point of how you work with your client base, kind of how you help them build collections.
That's a great question, because that is actually a question of like, what does an art advisor do?
Yeah.
Like,
How do you advise?
Well, some people are more advisable than others. I think one of the things that I find very funny, and to me, it's just amusing, is that typically art collectors are those who obviously have to have the means to, some means to collect, or who are looking into this based on their passion, research, investment, whatever it may be, that you can decide to collect. However, your reasoning is all good. We're not here to judge that. But like, they typically if you're a client, you are good at, you're successful at you've done well for yourself enough, right?
Yeah.
And what I find is that sometimes, and you don't really do that, like, say, with your lawyer or architect, right? Where you think that just because you're very good at your job, you're good at my job. And it's like, that to me is,
Do you know how many people I know who act like that?
where it's like, well, I understand that you read about our business, or you're like well versed, or you have enough access to information, and you're one of the most successful people in the world. But perhaps you should allow me to do my part so that I can serve you. So that gets, where it's like, that personality comes through of like, well, I run this I know. I'm like, well, no, you run this company. You don't run this company. But look, anyone who wants to collect art, I love them, because they want to support artists and the industry. So to me, there are so many ways that you could be spending your money, and not everybody sees the value of it. Other people are like, why would I do that? That costs as much as XYZ. And yes, it is very true. Even if you want to start at where you're like, you know what, I have $500 or $1,000, which is a lot of money, by the way, to like say, I have that as my disposable income.
Yeah.
That meaning you've paid your bills, you've done everything, and you're like, I want to put this towards art. To me, that's really respectable, because it's not, those are just headlines, which are good. You have to read about the $50 million art. And that is the whole point. That's what you are supposed to read about. But you don't read about maybe the 500 or 1,000. But someone who decides to do that means that they have made a choice to do this. And that's very noble, in my opinion. And I'm very respectful of that. And so you have to really look at it over, if that's what you want to do, we're here to kind of navigate it. But you have to be willing to listen. And that is something that is important. You have to actually listen, because there's so much info in front of us, right? Yes, you can Google things, you can have a relationship with, like, you can go to a couple of openings and art fairs, and you can get invited to things, and you can do all sorts of, you can spend hours on Artsy and on ArtNet, but that doesn't make you an expert.
Yeah.
The way we assess the market, the way we assess the same auction result, right? And the way we assess an artist's career, the way we assess the trajectory of the market and trajectory of an artist, and the way we consume is very different than someone who this is not their profession. And that is just a fact. You cannot, in my opinion, you can't even really question that.
Yeah.
And that is the thing that I think we have to really highlight. If we all look at the same auction results because they're public knowledge, I will assess it in a very different way than a normal person who's not in the business, because we're looking at data there's all sorts of other parameters that are leading into it. So you can't just extract one or even 10 things and say, well, this says this, so we have to go with it. It's like, no, there's 50 different things that have contributed to what you're seeing.
Yeah.
Or, I have a really great example. This is in last September, where there was a great artist that was showing at, and let's just keep it generic, and because there's no point in like kind of, getting here. But this really wonderful kind of young artist had a great show at a very respectable mid-tier gallery. And yes, his prices were a little bit high if you looked at it on its own. And I remember telling one of my clients that I really think this is someone worth looking into. And I have a feeling, first of all, because the paintings are spectacular, and I am not always drawn to paintings, as everyone knows. I like very, very difficult work. My God, do I make my job difficult. If it's difficult, unsellable, uninstallable, is laced with like every turmoil, I'm like, this is beautiful. Let's go with it. So for me to be drawn to paintings, it takes like a lot. And so these paintings were just quite mesmerizing, actually, given his rather young age, like the level of sophistication. And the prices were kind of reflective of that. They were not low prices, but they weren't also astronomical in the way we're used to some prices. And he was showing with a really, really incredible mid-tier gallery. So I said to my client, I really think you guys should look into his work. I think he's on this really good cusp. And their view was, which is fine, but it's a great example. Their view was, well, I'm going to keep looking at him because he's got a ways to go and he's kind of expensive. So why should I? I said, actually, because I think he's about to shift. And yes, maybe he's expensive, but you probably didn't look at him 5 years ago. So here we are. We're here today, And that is exactly what happened. And that this wasn't based on any, sometimes it is, maybe it's intel or it's because I've been reading about it or following it. This was purely based on like understanding kind of like the trajectory of like how we look at things. And sure enough, that's what happened. And I think this is precisely what an art advisor should do, is recognizing moments and time that are not always obvious. Yeah. Now, for the sake of this conversation, I wanted to make it as simple and obvious, but it was actually not as obvious. But it's the not obviousness of it, of why it makes sense, of why you have to look at it. I recently at the art fair in Ibiza. That in itself is really funny, where people are like, oh, Ibiza has an art fair. I thought it's just this and this.
And I wanted to touch on that because I was like, when did Ibiza get an art fair? What happened here? Nazy, why are you there?
Because I've been looking at it for a very long time. And I know that it was only a matter of time when you have this like very thriving, center of creativity where artists and kind of patrons go and you have history that goes back, it would happen. But I'm looking at an artist going, this wonderful young man, also a painter. By the way, we might be seeing a shift in me. I don't know what's happening. I'm looking at paintings.
Maybe you're shifting. Yeah.
I don't know. I am. I have to we have to assess this on a different time. I need to spend some time assessing what's going on with me. But it is, and I know you want to talk about that, so we'll come back to that. But it is looking at work and having a deeper understanding of the why, or understanding the market of, yes, just because it's very high I'm not saying that it's going to tank. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that it's going to hit a very good long-term, and plateau is the wrong word, but it's going to stay at a certain level because he or she will be protected. So this is a protected market we're looking at. You either have to make a move now or you're going to miss out. And those are the things that are very important. No matter how passionate and knowledgeable you might be as a collector, the level of expertise and understanding of the nuances that a professional has, or a professional who's good, I guess, let's be clear. Not everybody's created equal. Yes. Not all eyes are created equal. Yeah. So I also say this from a position of like, I really believe in my instinct and in my eye, and I've honed in my market, so I can say these things, but I can only speak for myself.
I mean,
obviously.
Connoisseurship is a real talent.
Yes. So that is something to take into account. And so where a relationship becomes great is it's the listening on both ends. You have to listen to what the client wants. And I'm very proud of that in my own and by the way, if I tried to do with my own eye on everybody would just like be like, forget it. So no, we would be like running for the hills. So I really try to understand what a client is asking and saying and reading between the lines, but also what I think will appeal to them and why it's good. And it actually has really nothing to do with me in a weird way. Like, that's what I mean about the detachment. It's about saying, well, this artist that I think you will want to know is good for all these reasons. Is it Nazi's favorite? No, it doesn't need to be. As a matter of fact, when you start making it about yourself, that is the wrong, you better just that you're just not good at what you're doing if it's about. Now, I tend to go, I'm always drawn to certain artists. So you will probably also know if you want a certain type of collection or certain type of artist, you'll know. You'll know when it's like my eye or my, something I gravitate towards. But those are very different skill sets, by the way, right? Because what I gravitate towards personally or what I might really admire and respect, and if that's of your interest, then we can look at it. But me looking at it from a professional expertise, that's also a very different thing. So I really try to quite listen to the client and be intuitive, but also take into account what will make sense from a business and investment point of view. But then trusting that I will be able to bring something to the table that you just hadn't thought of. And that is very important. You have to really listen on both ends. And the client has to feel more confident in saying, yes, I'm going to, just because I have some expertise and passion and knowledge and, I know all the top galleries and I know 5 artists, that doesn't mean that that's the expertise that will set it. And that's something that I would want to get out there more. But one example I wanted to give was, for a client where I knew them, I knew their collection, and I've had many conversations with them. And also I'm just really truly fond of them. And this work became available in the secondary market. And I just reached out and they kept saying, but how, and it was so out of the blue. They're like, but how did you know? How did you know like, why? Did we tell you? I said, no, but ideally I know I did my job. But so it's really knowing what a client wants, but also being very pragmatic about making sure you're delivering the right thing to them and why. But you can do all that, and if somebody doesn't want to listen, they're not going to listen, and they're going to, sometimes they, I've had where, it becomes a matter of kind of like personalities and egos, and I know I'm somewhat of a big personality. So, it becomes like, okay, like a bit of a defiance. But, all of that comes with the territory, and it's actually why it's so good and why I love it.
Yeah.
It kind of comes with it.
Yeah, but before we, shift towards the end of this conversation, I do want to talk a little bit about Cannes in Ibiza.
Okay, tell me. What do you want to know?
Everything, because this is the first time like I've heard about it, and I saw you went there. I mean, I vaguely kind of know there's a burgeoning art scene in Ibiza, but I didn't know that. Is this fair new?
Okay, well, I'm so glad you brought it up. And I actually think, first of all, I hope they'll be happy that I'm going to be talking about it, which I think they will. But I'm so glad you're bringing it up. And I know it just happened, so it's kind of nice to talk about, because it's a great snapshot of who I am and what I do, actually, for some reason. It kind of, all the pieces met. It's very on brand, as you can imagine.
Yes.
So for starters, as you know, that my husband is in the music industry. He's an entertainment lawyer for electronic music, and that's his profession. But
you loved electronic music before him.
Before, it's what brought us together way before
Makes
that.
Sense.
So it's really, it was just happened that, and this is something, like I said, from a very young age, as I mentioned earlier in our segment, where when I first heard this music, it was life-changing for me. And I just knew that my creative practice and life would be intertwined with it. I didn't
Which
know
also
how.
makes sense why you worked with Carl Craig.
Yes, exactly. Which is also exactly working with Carl Craig was such, just let's talk about that for a minute. The privilege of working with Carl Craig and the project Adia was, I have a wild imagination. This went beyond my wildest imaginations. And one being that Dia as an institution is the one institution that I just have always worshipped, because it represents everything about minimalism, land art, theoretical conceptual practices that translate into
But they also
work.
take risks, and they're very like ahead of their time.
Their risk taking and the fact that they work with artists for years and years to realize a project. Unfortunately, I also view my work this way, and let me tell you, it is slow.
Yeah.
But kind of going back to what I love. So, and then someone like Carl Craig, who's absolute legend, but also someone who we know well, who's like near and dear. So to be involved with that project was, I mean, how do you even, you have to take it. It's actually when I was talking about like my time and the work that was like kind of being on the ground in the Middle East at that time, you have to take it and say, this is a moment. This is a very critical moment, but also discourse, creative discourse, because it talked about, and let's take the personal out of the way. And the personal meaning my love of the music, my love of Quora, my love of Dia. And my love of like the minimalism and working for business. So let's take all that and let's go a little bit more broad. So what we're talking about is the history of techno, the history of Black techno, the history of sound and minimalist sound, and how do you convey that in an installation? I mean, I have zero desire to retire, but let me tell you, that would have, that would have been a good one. So to me, but on the contrary, it's the opposite of retiring. That is the kind of thing that happens that is a catalyst for more to come. That means it simply has just begun. It just so happened that Dia was willing to take the risk, and Carl is such a visionary that it could only happen when you brought these two these two elements together. And even from my end, that I feel like only someone like me who had already been thinking about these kinds of practices of evolution could kind of like be part of it and be like, okay, I want to like actually be part of it and really be part of it and like have that experience. And so that is a great thing to talk about, of why it's important and why I have always looked at these, and that it matched kind of what I had said in putting when I was looking to work with galleries and like kind of putting these like proposals together where everyone thought I was out of my mind. As a matter of fact, what I put down ended up being realized in almost every capacity. And that's the thing. It just was realized under me working on my own that it was being realized. So Cannes Art Fair. I'm so glad you brought that up, because so my love of music, my husband's industry, it's kind of like these worlds that are all intertwined. And so we've been going to Ibiza for a long time. And of course, I cannot go anywhere and just be a passive visitor. It is a curse. I always look to things. You have to look and see like the art, the ecosystem, the community, the culture. I am just not a passive observer of anything, including my vacation. But the thing with Ibiza, which is quite a magical island and really the land of all things electronic music, if you will. And at the same time, there's this really great art ecosystem, right? There's history of patronage, kind of like old families from Spain, or like kind of from the time of Picasso, and like really just it's all there. But it's the wild and the bohemian that kind of all exists. So that has been there for a long time. It was just a matter of like when it would be translated into like the contemporary way that we know of it. And pre-pandemic, there were pop-ups. There was like a Murakami exhibit. There was a Tracy Emin exhibit. They were attempts made, but then also there is like really respectable galleries like Para Romero, who's an institution in Spain, and they have great space in Madrid and also in Ibiza for like years, have been showing in their warehouse. And so they've always been these tidbits of it happening. And I believe with Cannes, it's 3 years old, and Sergio Sancho, who is the visionary founder, started it 3 years ago. He also has a fair in Madrid. And from my understanding is there were probably other attempts for people wanting to do this, like, oh, let's just have a fair. But you have to do the timing has to be right, but you also have to have the belief and the vision, and which is what kind of drew me to him. I'm like, this is someone who really is doing this because they have the vision and the understanding. And so the fair is 3 years old, and this was the third year. And it's really tapping into this really great emerging kind of local market, but also galleries from Spain are exhibiting, but then galleries from New York, such as The Hole, I think this is their second year that have shown. Fundación Las Salinas, which Leo Malca heads, has been there for many years, who's done riveting exhibits from Bill Viola to Keith Haring to Kenny Scharf. This year it was with Mai Blanca, who was incredible, Spanish artist. So there's a beautiful ecosystem that's happened. And I mean, but having said that, obviously, if there was a fair in Ibiza and I wasn't involved, I mean, how would that even work? And so the way it happened is I really thought that, look, art fairs today, but always, they are a center of gravity, right? There's programming, it brings collectors and artists and practitioners and museums together, it brings visitors together. It's just a cultural moment. And we all know this because how many art fairs do we go to?
Tons.
A lot.
They're
I wish
everywhere.
I could go to less. And so, and it kind of goes back to even when I launched Art Middle East and I did it with the Armory Show, like, it's a good launching ground. But I just sincerely believe that if there was a fair in Ibiza, and you have to highlight the music, you have to highlight the history of electronic music. And that was really my belief of it. And then separately, the fair, Sergio, who's again someone I tremendously respect, they, based on our conversations that we had, and then they put together a small pop-up exhibit that was curated by Christian Len, who wrote a book a couple of years ago called Balearic, La Historia Oral de la Cultura de Ibiza. And it's basically the oral history of nightlife in Ibiza. And these incredible cast of characters give their oral, history, from DJ Harvey to Danny Whittle to, kind of the others from the past. And it traces, it's anecdotes that go back all the way from the 50s and the way the nightlife evolved, and because it's truly this foundational culture. And so that was the great book. And then there was a pop-up exhibit called Postering Ibiza 1980 to 2020, who Christian also put together. And it was really just that, capturing these really great posters, because the visual communication of clubs and nightlife, especially in Ibiza, it's an art form. I mean, it is an incredible art form.
Yeah.
And you're talking in the 80s, there were these psychedelic, futuristic, but then it kind of evolved later on to what Richie Houghton and Enter did and Sven Rath with Cocoon did, where they became really minimalist, and Richie Houghton is really inspired by minimalist art. And so that was kind of the pop-up that happened, that Christian curated, the fair kind of decided to do. My small contribution was, kind of facilitating with the Inter poster and the Cocoon poster. But then based on that, I also did programming, which was the panels to really actually, you have a book about the oral history, you have a pop-up about the past history, but it's oral, so we should talk about it.
Yeah.
And so the panel one was literally just that, about the oral history of nightlife and the visual kind of culture that went with it. And that panel was with John Acquaviva, who's quite legendary, not just a DJ and producer, but also someone who really has been at the forefront of, the business and investing in sound and technology, and someone who's, now calls Ibiza, his home. And then Danny Whittle, who has been behind some of the greatest promotions in clubs, 13 years at Pasha, really a true gentleman and ambassador for nightlife. And he too, the stories, he moved in the 90s to Ibiza and, can tell you. And so, and Christian moderated that. I introduced that talk, but essentially that talk was to shed the narrative of some of these programming. And then separate from that, the second talk, I did that with Tamer Malki, who's one half of Bedouin, the DJ duo Bedouin, who are, they really changed the sound. Tamer is from Jordan, and his partner is his family is from Egypt. And the way they incorporate Middle Eastern sounds into, it's this moody desert Middle Eastern sounds. And they actually really were at the forefront of it. And they actually, they created like a whole new genre based on the music that they do. And they have a residency at Pasha. And they, it's very surreal, inspired by Louise Bourgeois. It's called Saga. And now imagine, they're someone who I love, that I listen to all the time. As a matter of fact, sometimes if you listen to someone long enough, they appear and you do a talk with them.
Yeah, you manifest it.
You manifest it. But, to me, incorporating Middle Eastern sounds, but also this like really beautiful new, being at the forefront of like really introducing this new sound, being pioneers of it, but also the resistance that comes with it and some of the prejudices that comes with it, but also doing a residency that takes kind of surrealist art. I mean, it doesn't get any more like, how many more things can we add to this that is just so perfect? So I had the privilege of doing a kind of a one-on-one conversation, and those were the programming. And that speaks of really bringing all my passions together, like, but also the kind of work at Nazhand Art and Culture we do, which is these, bringing these disciplines together. But also from an advisor point of view, I have been on the ground really from the get-go. I know, the kind of market that is developing. And I don't want to say market because that's such a wrong word to use for like being on the ground in Ibiza, but you do have like really true great art patronage that can develop. And that's, it's exciting. It's wonderful. It was a great fair. There was like, really great galleries that were there. So it was, it is all the things that I think is right with how we kind of have a responsibility to be open and to pursue pursue the profession in all the right ways. And certainly for me and my practice, it really highlights the way I go about working with clients and the way I want to approach kind of discovering artists and the way I want to approach, and I hope I do approach, in bringing these disciplines together and really like bringing meaningful and groundbreaking, collaborations to life. And, you can say all that, but you don't always have to do like ginormous, big, it can be steps, right? And so hopefully, maybe for next year, if Sergio will have me back, we'll do even more ambitious programming. But that's a good example of, how I strive to grow the practice. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I definitely wanted to touch on that because I found it so interesting. But before we head into the fire round of questions, my last question to you is, what advice do you have for women in the industry or women who are just coming into the industry?
That's a great question. It's an obvious question, but it's not. It's a really, you have to really think about it. So thank you for, thank you for saying it last, by the way, just so that I can like kind of go back to and think about what I said. But I think the landscape has changed so much that I wonder if someone like me and the way I started, I even can give advice anymore, because it's like a whole other world. Having said that, it's also not. Our industry is not that big. It's really, it is big, but it is not. It is a small community. So certain ways of doing things have completely shifted, whether it's technology or just evolution of it and the growth and the number of galleries and the number of artists and the number of things. So while all of those things have happened, some things still hold true. You have to work really hard. You have to pay your dues. You have to get your hands dirty. If you think you're too good for something, you're in lots of trouble. The only thing that I think I'm too good for is when someone has the wrong intention or doesn't value the artist or like wants to be like kind of like sabotage the business. Where in that case, I'm like, no, absolutely not. You're coming to the wrong person. But as far as the work, you need to do the work. And really, and this is something I just did not have enough of, which was the mentorship and allies. I feel like when I first started, I just felt a lot of resistance, and almost just like prejudices, foreignness to it. I don't know what it was, but I would say, but that also comes with time. Maybe because I was too new at it. So maybe it's not just the other side. The problem is also me. I just didn't have the network, but now I do. So that takes time to build. So you have to really build trusted relationships and protect your relationships and look after your relationships and really and be well informed. And that is the thing. It's not just about like, well, do I know my art history? I mean, it's every single day something. So
Yes.
you have to like read a lot and be aware. But I would say really decide that this is what you want to do. And if that's what you want to do, I mean, I'm sorry, like maybe, are you sure? But if you do decide this is what you want to do, you really have to make a commitment because it is not easy. The pay is not great. Just because you read about the big numbers, they really have nothing to do with like reality. And yeah, that I mean, it sounds, they're all very, I don't want to say, they're all very general, but it is you have to be very committed in wanting to do this. And you have to be just really willing to embrace the industry, because on the other side of it is if all you do, and we know plenty of people where just they're like constantly criticizing and like hating on it, which at that point it's like maybe it's just not for you.
Exactly.
I know it can be bad, but it's not that bad.
Yeah.
I mean, my God, look at us. We get to work with great artists and look at our, it's not that bad.
Yeah.
So if you really are unhappy with it, then perhaps you want to evolve into a different profession.
Yeah.
But I am here if anyone wants my feedback or advice or opinion. So I like to pay it forward, and I really do that. I make a point of doing that. And so if I can pay it forward somehow, I like to do that.
That's a great attitude to have, just to, pay forward. But are you ready for the fire round of questions?
I think so.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
I've heard about these. I think I'm ready.
So you pick a number between 1 and 10, and then I'll read the corresponding question to you.
Okay. 9.
What do you always travel with? You travel a lot, so this is good for you.
I do travel a lot. My God, do I travel a lot. And every time I make a declaration that I'm going to travel less, I travel more. So I need to just stop saying that. And well, the thing is, I mean, obviously my phone, but I don't know, earplugs and eye mask.
Okay.
And those I definitely have to have on my laptop. And I have a big Remova bag, and I just travel mainly with that because I rather have a bigger bag than carry 17 small bags and then claim that I'm traveling light or claim that I'm like only traveling with a carry-on. It's like, well, if you have 4 garment bags and 3 duffel bags and a bag and a backpack, you're not really traveling.
Yeah.
But I also think just having one big bag makes my life easier. I have literally this big Remova bag that got on my recent trip back, Vueling airline, broke the entire handle. And to me, because they're so well screwed in, I don't think a human could have done that.
Yeah, what were they doing?
I have no idea, but the entire thing broke. But thankfully, it was replaced. But I just my suit. Those are the things that I have to have. But that's it, like the most basic things. But if you don't have it, it will make life very difficult for you.
Exactly.
Bottle of water, but just all the things so that you can just be efficient. And I find that that's the most important thing for me. I'll take anything and everything that I need as long as I can be efficient when I'm on the ground, because once I'm on the ground, I am on the ground.
Yeah.
There is not a minute that is not accounted for. You
should see me on the TSA line. I'm like this.
Yeah.
Like, here's my stuff, go.
You just go.
Yeah.
But I also take, I'm not a light, how can I be a light traveler when I travel for work? We have events, we have outfits, we have books, we have, things. So I take a nice bag that I'm able to just put things and not worry about it and just like send it out and send a prayer.
That's good.
And, track it and go about my business.
Yes, that's smart.
Yeah.
Okay, one more question.
Okay.
Pick a number.
Let's do 4.
4. What is a passion project you want to complete?
I mean, isn't everything I do a passion project?
Is there anything that you have in your heart that you're like, I need to do this? It's on my bucket list. Or like an artist that you're like desperate to work with.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's a whole other question.
Okay, so whatever's easier.
Okay, so that's you know, because art is such a passionate thing, so much of what I do is what I love and involves, no matter where I go, I see the art. So that's very well covered. But I guess I know the question, I know what you're asking. So I would say it's probably two things. One, and I've started doing it, is that time, right? You life. We live in New York, so there's a lot. So I would say becoming fluent in Spanish again, that I used to be most of my life, is an important goal. So it's more of a goal than and because I think there's no excuse for someone like me to not be completely native fluent.
Keep going to Ibiza and
Exactly.
it might
If I just
happen.
keep going to Ibiza, I'll be okay. So I would say that I really realized that I had been out of practice, that like I'm not as fluent as I used to be. And that was just like, that's just because lack of practice and not putting the time. And the other thing is, I am a very late skier. I learned skiing very late in life and I am terrible at it. And I would say that is probably something that I need to put everything in to get better at it, because I quite love it. It's just that, what's funny is just that, well, first of all, my childhood didn't really allow for lovely ski trips.
Of course.
But also I am such a sunny person. I like sun destinations that by choice I wouldn't go, right?
Yeah.
And so now that I do and I love it and I'm terrible at it, that is something I need to like really pick up on. So that I would say that takes priority.
Okay.
So the next time we meet, watch out. I will be on the slopes.
Okay.
fast.
I'll see you there. I'm like the opposite. Like anytime I travel, I always travel to cold climates. Like bury me in a mountain of snow and I'm happy.
Really?
Yeah.
Why?
I don't know. It's just me.
Why
and
do you
cold
want to
weather.
be cold?
I don't know. I love it. And just snow, cold, I feel like I have the reverse of like, when people say they have seasonal depression when winter hits.
Right.
I have it like the reverse when summer comes around. I'm like, no, it's so hot.
I mean, I am definitely. Having said that, I love the mountains and I now really love skiing. But every time I pack for skiing, I go, this could be a bikini. I'm like, this could just be a bathing suit instead of like four bags. But yeah, I would say those two things, to keep it kind of light and fun. I would say it's those things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I had such a lovely time talking to you and you shared so many great tips and tricks and, experiences that you've had. So thank you so much for joining me on the Art Pod.
Thank you for having me. I really quite love your podcast. So for me to be part of this is a real treat. And thank you for allowing me to speak so honestly and openly. I think I hadn't really done that in this level. So thank you for allowing me, for making me feel so comfortable.
Of course.
Thank you.
Of course. I'm happy to have you anytime.
Thank you.
And to all my listeners, thank you for tuning in and I'll see you guys next week. Bye.